leadership is hard. You are responsible in some capacity for the wellness of the people on your team. So for me, that transparency has to come through the lens of, does this team need to know this to do their work? Yes or no? Okay, if the answer is no, then like, why do you need to tell them? Is this going to hurt them in some capacity? Are they going to be worried about something that they don't need to be worried about? Is it going to just create chaos where there doesn't need to, and kind of having that internal checklist of what is in the best interest of this team and recognizing that there are different layers within your team.
Hey everybody, this is Jeremy Tiers from Tutor Collegiate Strategies, and you're about to check out the latest episode of the Mission of Mission podcast, a show that's designed to help higher ed become better recruiters, communicators, marketers, and managers. Each week I'll introduce you to an industry leader or difference maker who will share helpful advice, tips, and strategies that will help you grow professionally and personally. Mission of Mission is part of the Enrollify podcast network and is made possible by Gecko, an engagement platform that makes it easy for your team to deliver a better student experience. I'm excited to share my latest candid conversation, so let's get started. Hey everybody, it's Jeremy Tiers, and this is episode 26 of the Mission Admissions podcast. And of all the topics that listeners email and message me about, leadership is definitely at or near the top of the list. So I am super excited for today's guest. It is a conversation that's long overdue. Angie Cooksy is an amazing leader and just an absolutely wonderful human. So I'm excited to have her share all of her thoughts, tips, strategies with everybody today. Welcome to the show, Angie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Well, Angie is very well known in the admissions EM space. For those of you listening who aren't familiar, Angie is the Assistant Vice President for Enrollment Management at Bradley University. You'd probably want me to say go Braves, so I'll say go Braves. You've been there for what, 16 years now? Have I got that right?
Yeah.
What's the biggest difference, you think, Angie, between when you started and just where the admissions and enrollment management profession is right now?
When I started, we still reviewed applications on paper. So I guess that's going to date me a little bit. We had like manila, and for those of you who've been around a long time, you had like your manila envelope, and you went and you got your envelope and you reviewed your file and you made your notes on it and you passed it on to the next person in the process. So certainly the technology that we have is so different. And I think it continues to be different. I think it's different than it was 5 years ago, honestly. I think the students are different. And I think there's some challenges with that because people want to continue to do this work the same way we've always done it. I think we've seen more change in the student landscape, in the landscape of enrollment, in our professionals, in what we expect of our professionals in the last 5 years than maybe we've seen in the last decade and a half. And if we don't talk about it, then I think that that's doing all of us a disservice, honestly.
If you had to narrow it down, because you made a statement there that I find myself making a lot, and I hear a lot as I'm having conversations with people in this higher ed enrollment management space. We do it this way. We've always done it this way. Narrow it down, Angie. One or two like big reasons. Why is that? Why is that such a struggle for so many?
One, I think it's easy, right? Hey, I already know how to do this. So I know how to do it. I know it's worked in the past. Let's just keep doing that. And I don't fault anybody for that. We have a lot to do and we have a lot of work. And if you know something works, I don't blame you for being like, let's just keep going. I think what we're seeing across the landscape is in a different moment in time, those things aren't necessarily working anymore. And so I think it's really then where you have to pause and say, okay, are we doing what we're doing because we've always done it? And is it working? I think that's the key. Because if you just say you're doing what you've always done and that's why you're going to keep doing it, it's probably not doing your team or your students or your institution the best service. If you say, hey, we're doing what we've always done and it's working, we're getting the outcomes that we want, we're supporting our team the way we want, we're supporting our students the way we want, that's awesome. Like, don't change something if it's great. But if the answer to those things aren't, yes, we're doing these things and they're working, then maybe it's time to stop and pause and assess. I don't believe you have to change everything. And I think that's the other reason that we get stuck, and this is how we've always done it. Because sometimes it's hard to make incremental changes because they don't feel that big. And so it doesn't feel like you're doing anything. And so then everybody just wants to do the biggest thing. The biggest change is hard to make, right? And so then it's daunting. It's like, we're going to climb this mountain and we're going to expect to get to the top tomorrow. Nobody has the energy anymore to do that, right? We're tired and there's a lot going on. And so I think if you can create the energy on your team to say, we're going to make this incremental change and we're going to assess it. We're going to make this incremental change and we're going to assess it. And then when we do these two or three things, we're going to make a big jump and we're going to assess it. I think you can build some capacity in there and it makes it easier for everybody to take on change in a way that right now is sometimes really hard.
I totally agree. And I think too often I hear to your point, well, we have to make big changes. And I'm like, no, those small incremental changes you just talked about, Angie, are so you've been at one place for almost 16 years, as we've already hit on. What's kept you in one place, Ange?
I get asked this question all the time. I often joke I feel a little bit like a unicorn left in this field just because typically people move around and that's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a reality of our space. I have been extraordinarily lucky at Bradley to be continuously challenged to be creative and to be innovative and to take on new responsibilities and to learn new things. I ask a lot of questions. Anybody that has ever worked with me knows that. And I've been lucky to have leadership at Bradley during that time that has said, okay, you got questions about it? Like figure out how to do it or bring something to the table and maybe we'll do it and maybe we won't. But if you're curious about it, go and explore it and see what happens. And I think those are a lot of the reasons that I've stayed. I certainly have worked with tons of professionals and colleagues that are like, I don't have space in my role to do that, or I've reached the place where I can't do anything else. And I respect that. That's true of a lot of the places that we've been in or that exist in our field. I think for me, having had those leaders I worked with, Rodney San Jose hired me at Bradley. He's at Illinois Central College now. I worked with Annie Kramer. Annie Kramer hired me. She was on my search committee. I got to work with people like Julie Nelson. She worked at Bradley right as I was transitioning to Bradley. It's it's really just amazing people that have taught me so much about this field and have these really cool connections to my institution that I've been able to continue to learn and grow from. And then for the last, I don't know, 10 or so years, I've worked with Dr. Justin Ball, who was such a remarkable person for me as I grew my leadership to say, hey, use your best professional judgment, Angie. And I will tell you the number of times that he said that. And I was like, I just want you to give me an answer. But it really challenged me to learn how to think on my own and to be able to bring forward an idea, to justify it, to be able to defend it, and to be able to show, like, here's why. And I think that's been a huge part of my ability to stay one place. This is kind of a tangent off of that, but even just that little bit, I think that's where a lot of people get stuck is they're like, well, I brought forward an idea and nobody wants to do anything with it. An idea doesn't matter if you don't have something behind it. If you can't bring the data, if you can't say, here's how I want to test it, here's the audience that I want to look at, here's why I want to justify it. And having had the space to be able to test some of that and learn has been really beneficial. And I don't take for granted at all.
It is interesting you describe all of that because the word that kept going through my brain when you described it all that way, Angie, was culture, right? And I don't know if that's the right word or not, but when you're around people where, again, you feel, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but empowered, valued, right? Given some freedom to grow, to test new things out, and to be a part of change. And you feel like personally and professionally, like, hey, I'm headed in the direction I want to head in. I would argue it doesn't mean you still don't have bad days, but to your point, like the good days and all the positive things outweigh the bad, right? So when did you first know? Because I really want to dive in a lot of our conversation. I know how passionate you are about leadership, and those are one of the things that we have very much in common with each other. So when did you first know that leadership was something you wanted to try? Like walk us through. I remember that aha moment, if you do, where I'm like, yep, this is something I want to do, whether it's tomorrow, next week, 10 years from now.
I don't know if I had an aha moment, honestly. I am the oldest of six kids. So I think just naturally, that's just how I grew up. When you have that many humans in your life, like just naturally like count to make sure everybody got in the car that day, right? Like you're just naturally taking assessment of your surroundings, or at least I was, because I was 12 when my youngest sibling was born. So there wasn't this huge age gap. We all grew up together, and there's just a lot of humans in my house all the time. And so I think I just naturally am in spaces where that's just the way that my brain thinks. I'm assessing what could we do better, who is in the room, who needs to be in the room, who's missing. Like I said, I ask a lot of questions, and I think I'm just naturally curious about things. And so I think that's been a huge part of my growth in leadership is just, hey, why do we do this? And then for a long time, I just wasn't getting really good answers, right? And that's not necessarily an enrollment, that's across the board. People are like, oh, like, thanks for asking questions, like, come back later. And I think I just kept asking, and people were like, oh my gosh, if we just tell you, will you like stop asking questions? And I think that just having that space is just who I am naturally, and kind of leaning into that. And I will say I was not always as confident in my own voice and that curiosity as I've grown into. I think for a long time I had questions and I was curious about things, and you kind of knew in the back of my head I was like, "Oh, I would do it different." Not that I would do it better, but I would probably do this differently than other people were doing it. And it took me a long time of just being able to like test the waters, and even in smaller spaces. Again, I think that's like I was talking about earlier, like there's this idea that it has to be this big thing. Not every leadership moment is a huge moment. Some of it is merely that first time that you ask a question. Some of it is getting feedback from somebody and saying, "Hey, here's how I think that this went. What are your observations of that? Is there anything in this that maybe I could do differently or that I could learn from?" All of those are moments of leadership too. And I think for me, it's been learning where to stop and pause and reflect, and where to ask for feedback, and then how to assess that feedback, because every piece of feedback that you get isn't necessarily something that you have to apply, right? And I think that's part of the leadership journey is like some people are going to tell you, hey, you really need to be this. If you try that on and it doesn't fit you, then you're never, I don't think, able to be authentically yourself if you're always trying to do something else. And so you asked for a moment. I guess I just don't know that there is one. It's more just that kind of natural curiosity for me.
No, and I appreciate you sharing. And to your point, I don't think there is an aha moment for everybody, right? It is ironic because I am the oldest as well. Didn't have six. There was three of us, but you just, it's funny as I get older and I talk with people, Angie, and some of it I wonder is just, again, the DNA, the life circumstances we grew up in, right? People are like,
Sure.
Jeremy, how do you have no problem getting up in front of like 1,000 people and talking? I'm like, I don't know. It's just not hard for me, right? There's a lot of things I suck at. There's a lot of things that are hard for me, but
Right.
and I don't know where it comes from, right? I don't know if it comes from being, the eldest child. I don't know if it comes from being in a family that was teachers. Like, I don't know. But
Yeah.
it's just something that, again, for me, I haven't struggled with. But I love the point you made, which previous guests have made as well, which is like leadership doesn't have to be one big thing. We can
Yeah.
all lead. And quite honestly, those of you listening who might be at the counselor level, whether it's your first week or you're a couple years in, leading can happen in your own territory, even without, right, other things from your director, your associate director, your vice president. And to your point, I think it's, oh, if I don't have the title, I'm not leading. I would disagree.
It reminds me of my first year in admissions as I was an admission counselor. I had, that we've all had it, those like super random territories where I think it was Ohio, Kentucky, the I-80 corridor, for those of you who are familiar in Illinois. So it's like Kankakee, LaSalle, Peru. And then I had four high schools in the Chicago suburbs. It doesn't make sense. I was from the Chicago suburbs. And so my director at the time was like, we're going to give you some territory in Chicago suburbs. And there was this moment as we were going through and assessing goals and things like that I just kept feeling like something here isn't adding up. And I was very new. It was like months in. And I went to the person whose office was next to mine. I was like, hey, like something here seems weird, not adding up. And they were like, yeah, that does kind of look weird. And so then we together went to like another person and we were like, hey, more than we do on this. Like, does this seem weird? And so it was this series of sort of personal checks and balances of like, first of all, recognizing, hey, I have no idea what I'm doing. I've literally been in this space for a single digit number of months. Should I even be asking these questions? we ultimately discovered that in my teeny little territory, those 4 high schools in Chicago were being double counted towards my goal. And for our institution, those were big high schools. And so they were, had we not flagged that early on, it could have messed up our entire projections and the way that we had done things. And it was just one of those things, right? We all deal with a ton of data. We're all deal with lots of spreadsheets with lots of cells. It wasn't anything that was intentional or on purpose. It was just something got double counted. And it was, that was really when you, I guess coming back to that aha moment, I think that was one of those voices where I learned to trust my own gut to say, like, something feels weird about this. And I very much could have gotten a different answer, like, oh no, Angie, like this is how this happens and this is why you see this that way. And then I would have learned and that would have been awesome. And had it been a different result, sweet. Now I know how this is happening. It ended up being the other thing of, hey, yeah, this is a good catch. This would have been really tricky later on. And I hope that newer professionals in our fields, either whether you're just joining the field or you're brand new to the profession as a younger professional, learn how to take assessment of those types of things and raise their hand. Because I think that was one of those first times for me in admissions to say, hey, your curiosity can be really helpful here. And that sticks out to me still this day, 16 years later.
Well, 100%. What advice would you give somebody who is new to the profession, regardless of their age, but they're new to the profession and they're kind of like, I don't know, am I allowed to go like ask senior leadership these type of questions? Like, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first you need to look at what your organization culture is. Is should you go from, your question directly to your VP or your vice provost or whatever? Maybe not. Like maybe that's not the jump that you make for that initial question. I think it's don't not ask the question. Figure out how you can ask the question and who you can ask the question to. And even if that is, like I said, it was the person whose office was next door to mine. And then we kind of rallied and went to the next and kind of built it up. And it was one of those sort of checks and balances. If you have that ability, I think it's a really great way to learn how to ask questions and test the waters and see, hey, somebody that has a little bit more experience than me, how would they sort of assess this or look at this? But I will say, back to your original comment, Jeremy, about what has changed so much. This field has changed so much because of remarkable young professionals asking, why do we have to do it this way? If that's the position that you're in and you are newer to the profession, or you're in a new role at a new institution, or you're in a new role at the same institution, you have such a great ability to see things through fresh eyes and to ask, even if it's not to question, like, hey, I think something's wrong here, even if it's just a question, why does your institution do this the way that it does? If somebody doesn't have an answer for you, ask again, ask another person. Because I think a lot of things, and this is certainly something that I've learned, we have had a really great opportunity, or opportunity is the wrong word, but we've had a really great history at Bradley of people who have been at our institution for a long time. And that's awesome. The danger of that is that processes sometimes don't get written down because we know what we know. And so we just keep doing them. And so I think that's one of the things we've been working on a lot this summer is, okay, why do we do this? Where is it documented that that's why we do this? Okay, if it's not documented, why isn't it documented and where should it be documented? How are we going to know that this is the way that we do things if there's no actual process? It's just something that lives in somebody's brain. And so ask those questions and, ask for the documentation. Okay, where can I find that? Where can I find the process on how we make phone calls? What's our policy on sending individual emails versus bulk emails versus can I send text messages from my own cell phone, or do we have something within our CRM? If I'm sending things from my own cell phone, is there compensation for that? If there's not compensation for that, should I be sending things from my own cell phone? Those are all fair questions to ask. And if they don't have an answer for you, then I think that's where you start to say, like, hey, let's figure out why we don't have answers for these things and how can we make sure that we have policies and procedures in place so that we're doing really good work that's fair and ethical to all of the people on our team.
I appreciate you sharing all of that. I think that's going to help a lot of people because the situations you described there, right? And you gave some very applicable examples, come up all the time, I would argue, every single year when new people get hired. And quite honestly, even when people have been there for a long time And to your point, something has never really been documented and people haven't wanted to push back. I will be very curious to hear your answer because we have a common friend, DJ Menifee, who I know we both love, who I asked the same question to. What's the hardest skill, Angie, for most leaders you think to master?
I can't say for most leaders, right? Because I'm not most leaders. I'm my own leadership person, and I only know what lens I come through.
What's the first thing, though, that popped in your head? Because I got to believe something popped in your head.
It did. Well, and I just, and that's why I wanted to preface that because I don't want to speak for everybody. I think for me, it's been learning what the transparency is. I am a leader that really believes in transparency, and not everyone needs to know everything all the time, right? And so, really figuring out what is in the best interest of the people that I am here to serve. And as a leader, that's really the lens that I look through it with. Like, we're all on the same team, and how can we make sure that we're moving forward to the point of what we were talking about just a minute ago. I try and approach things really through a positive lens and a positive attitude. It does not mean that every day I am like sunshine and roses to be around. I can appreciate that. Like sometimes there's just crummy days and I let that affect me, and really monitoring that level of transparency of what does this team need to know? What helps their work? And what are some of the things that are maybe happening in the background that I as a leader need to deal with that they don't need to worry about, and that them knowing is not necessarily going to make anything better, and it's going to make them worry about things that they have no control over or that they can't necessarily have a voice in this exact moment. And I think that's something that I've really had to work on actively and figure out. I think especially somebody who's naturally curious, I think when I came into leadership in a more formalized role, I sort of was like, well, I would want to know this, so I'm going to make sure everybody else knows that. And that's not the best policy. And so, it's a little bit of trial and error. And I think on that, leadership is hard. You are responsible in some capacity for the wellness of the people on your team. So for me, that transparency has to come through the lens of, does this team need to know this to do their work? Yes or no? Okay, if the answer is no, then like, why do you need to tell them? Is this going to hurt them in some capacity? Are they going to be worried about something that they don't need to be worried about? Is it going to just create chaos where there doesn't need to, and kind of having that internal checklist of what is in the best interest of this team, and recognizing that there are different layers within your team. And so there might be some people on your team that need to know some of this information, right? Like maybe your direct reports or your part of your leadership team need to know that, but maybe others don't. And so really kind of being mindful of how you transmit that information, what the clarity is around that, and owning where your role is on that, I think is one of those things that I've really learned to assess, and certainly something that I actively have to think about. And so I think when you ask like what's the hardest thing, I think that thing that you're actively having to think about that doesn't just come naturally is the hardest thing for whatever your leadership role is, right? The things that come naturally of who you just are and how you show up, that's not hard for you. If that's just how you are, you don't have to think about it. But it's those things that you're actively like, okay, shoot, if I do, how do I, what do I, can I? Those are the things that I think are hard. And those are the things that you should reflect on and learn on and grow on.
Well, and going off that, and I don't know if the answer is the same, but I'm going to ask this question now. How has your leadership style evolved, Angie? Because you've been in multiple leadership positions, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. You were at the director, obviously, level as well before this. Just is it what you just described by far and away, Jeremy? That's the biggest way that I've evolved over my tenure in different leadership positions? Or is there something else when you look back where you're like, yeah, I either wasn't very good at this, I didn't understand like the importance of this. And so over the years in different roles, I've really evolved. I mean, anything top of mind?
Yeah, there's lots of things. I think leadership is so interesting because it's something you can always get better at and you can always grow at. I get the privilege of speaking a lot now. Gosh, 10 years ago, I was not good on stage. I don't know that I'm great on stage now, but I enjoy it more and I've learned more about how to be more engaging and more dynamic and more myself. So I think that's certainly for me a place that I have invested in and grown. Within my team, I think learning to create space for each one of our team members has been the most joyful part of this journey. We're in college admissions and there's a lot of turnover and there's a lot of new faces and there's a lot of different energies and there's a lot of different personalities, and creating a team where people feel like they can bring themselves to that and they can bring their best selves to that and they can show up as they are. I didn't know how to do that 10 years ago or 12 years ago or 15 years ago. I wouldn't have even known what that meant when I started in this field. And it's been really important to me as we've, as a society, become more transparent about authenticity and owning who you are and allowing yourself to show up, that we create spaces for that. Do we do it perfectly every day? No, but I think trying and recognizing it is something that I've been really proud of, is I've learned how to be a leader and making sure people feel like they can bring themselves, their whole self to this work, and learning how to model that. I think that that's been really important. I take my vacation days, like earth shattering news, right? But I know a lot of leaders in this field that don't, and they then that creates a culture where people are like, well, shoot, like, can I take my days? Like, if I take my days, do I need to take my computer? Like, people, I take my vacation days and don't take my computer places. And it's okay. This work will still happen. And so I think learning that has been really transformative for the way that I approach this work, and recognizing that people can't bring their whole and authentic selves if they don't have space to do that. And so that's, I think, as my own leadership style has changed, that I would self identify as one of the biggest changes.
You talk about actions there, and it just gets me thinking back to a conversation I had, gosh, 20 years ago almost, with a good friend, and I'm sure he'll never hear this, but his name was Barry Wooler when I lived up in Minnesota. And Barry said, Jeremy, don't tell me, show me. And so much it's this idea of, I think a lot of us talk, 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 talk. But to your point, do you model those same actions? Because if you don't, your team's going to your point, look and go, okay, we're saying this is important, but Angie really doesn't do that. So, like, am I? And it just, to your point, creates confusion and can lead, obviously, to a whole bunch of things that the audience, I'm sure, is familiar with that we don't need to get into. I would love to pick your brain. This is something I know, leadership related, has probably come up at least a half dozen times in the last 12 months in conversations I've had. This concept of you're an AVP, but let's say even if you were a VP, Angie, and you've obviously got somebody under you in the director role, and then you may or may not have people even under him or her, right, who are also managing staff who report to that director. How do you as an AVP go, all right, I want my staff to feel valued and like I care and like I'm present, but I also don't want to necessarily have my director feel like, boy, they're always going to Angie and not coming to me when they want to talk about stuff. So my question there is just, how do you find that balance as a senior leader to give your team what they need, but also be sure that your direct reports under you don't feel like, I kind of feel like Angie's stepping on my toes, or, okay, well, she's doing that. Like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. So, probably two examples that are a little bit different and that helps identify that for me. My director of undergrad admissions, or our director of undergraduate admissions, Mike Gavick, he's a remarkable professional. He's brilliant at what he does. We actually came through this field together. And so we discovered a few years ago that we actually went to the same summer institute. He was at a different institution than he is now. Obviously now he's at Bradley. We didn't know each other back then. We didn't meet during summer institute, but like we literally started the same month, the same year in this field, right? And then he came to Bradley a few years later. So I think he's been here 12-ish years, 13 years maybe. And we kind of have flopped roles throughout that. Sometimes I was the supervisor, sometimes he was the supervisor, sometimes we were co-directors. And so we did this work together. And we have really grown together to learn where our strengths are in that particular experience and environment. And there's things that he does that I, to this day, don't know how to do. Like, I am not the person that can most efficiently find things in Slate. I can get there eventually, right? But like he can do it in 10 seconds. And so a lot of the ways that we've grown our leadership team at Bradley is through that kind of dynamic of like, hey, this is really where you're really great and this is really where I'm really great, and like how can we support each other to make sure that it's the best fit for our team. That I appreciate as a very unique structure and a unique mindset, and really kind of case specific to the situation that we've had at Bradley, both having been there so long and kind of starting at the same time. It's been really beneficial for me to have kind of that partner in crime, right? To be like, hey, I just run this past you? Can I check myself on this, and to have that level of trust? I think when you're in any leadership role, to have people around you that you can trust and say like, hey, I'm not really sure what I'm doing right here. Like, what are your thoughts on that? And so, people like him, Sarah Doherty, who is our senior associate director and our regional counselor in Chicago, she is in the same capacity. She is one of those people that I'm like, hey, how can I trust like my own voice in this? I need to just check this, but I also want to make sure that you have the ownership and the autonomy to do the work that you need to do. That's been, for me personally, something that I've been so lucky to have. We, in the last year, hired a new director for graduate and international admission who is totally new to Bradley, totally new to our team. And I specifically remember, I don't know if she'll remember this moment, but we were in one of the grad and international meetings and somebody asked a question and I just naturally started answering. And I saw something kind of come over her face and I was like, oh my gosh, you totally jumped in it here, Angie. Like this is her meeting. This is her moment. You are here as a guest, honestly. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to defer to Amy on this. And she was like, thanks. And then she took it away and she killed it and she did a great job. Sometimes I think you have to step in it a little bit to realize that you're out of line and be like aware enough to be like, oh, shoot, like that was not my space or my role. And so kind of in that moment, I've really learned to check in with our directors and say like, hey, what do you need from me? How can I help make your job easier? In the AVP role, I think the coolest part of my job is helping my boss do his job or her job really, really remarkably. Like, what can I do behind the scenes that's going to make your life easier? And then in the same capacity, doing that for our directors. What fences can I get out of the way? What hurdles can I knock down before you get to them? Where can I help you? And that's been something I've really enjoyed about the AVP role. In some ways, it's been challenging because I'm like, what do I actually do? Right? Like, if you're a doer of things, I think sometimes leadership can be really hard because you're like, do I do anything now? Like, but if you stop and think about what are you helping for those around you so that they can do their job easier or more efficiently, or they can optimize their work, if you can clear some of that for them, like that's a really cool space to be. And it's been something that I really enjoyed about this sort of middle leadership space.
How do you then, and Mike, in that example, if you're comfortable sharing, say, all right, we're on the same page as each other. And how do we make sure the team also is in a loop so they know when to go to him, when to come to you, and there's not confusion when it comes down? Again, we'll call it to the boots on the ground.
Definitely something that's been a work in progress, I think, over the years. And it's certainly feedback that we've gotten. Like I said, it's not necessarily a model that I would say works every single place. I do know that there are places that have like that co-director model. We're not alone in that, but it's a smaller population. So we've really had to test the waters and figure that out. We meet with every single one of our counselors individually, like their individual meetings once a month, but we meet together. So they know that in those 30-minute meetings once a month, they have both of us and they can ask anything they want. They can talk about anything they want. We do a lot of territory management in those meetings. And those are really where we get the most, I think, innovative conversations that come because we approach the work that we do really differently. And he'll say something like this and I'll say something like that. In the day-to-day things, what we've really come to is he's based on campus, I'm based remotely. And so there's a lot of that day-to-day stuff, the hallway conversation, those quick, like, hey, I just need you for a second kind of things. And he handles a lot of that. And as he should, he's the director and he's the one that's most directly involved with sort of some of that day-to-day, like we have a walk-in, who's going to take it? I don't need to be involved in those conversations. Like, you have the autonomy to handle that and figure that out. And I, try to support where I can, to say, like, hey, if you need backup for something, like, let me know and let me help. But on the day-to-day stuff, that's really his role, and our director of grad's role. And then I just help where I can to make sure that they have the support and the resources that they need.
Open lines of communication. And then, the other word that was going through my brain a couple of times there was, you open yourself up to being a little vulnerable when you were describing some of that stuff. And that's okay. This whole idea of, like, in a position of leadership, you're not allowed to do that, I think, is a complete fallacy, right? I think you're allowed to do
Yeah.
that whether you're a leader or you're not a leader, right? That's who we are as human beings. One other leadership question I have, I'd love to get your thoughts on managing a team with staff members that are from different generations. I actually had this conversation with a VP who was in his 60s, and he said, Jeremy, how do I get my, like, 40-year-old staff to do the same thing as my 20-year-old staff? And I said, you don't, because they're different people. And I want to obviously turn it over to you and hear your thoughts, but obviously you see a lot of that in higher ed, right? Regardless of years of experience, you have staff who is generationally from different generations. Quick thoughts, tips, advice you would offer somebody who is working with staff from multiple generations?
First of all, you are working with staff from multiple generations. So I don't care where you are in the leadership spectrum in higher ed. That's just the nature of our work. There are potentially 5 generations in your workspace. I was telling somebody the other day, we have spent a lot of conversations talking about Gen Z. Gen Alpha is 12, friends. That means that they are about 3 admission cycles from being bought in search names. So it's coming. So we'll have Gen Alpha that we're recruiting. We'll have Gen Z that then's going to transition and is actually already in the workplace. We'll have millennials. We'll have Gen X. We'll have boomers. Like, everybody's here, right? So I think acknowledging that first and foremost, there are different people doing this work. They know how to do this work differently. That is okay. I think where we get sometimes stuck is saying the only way to do this is this way, and everyone has to do it the same. Here's the reality of that. You're going to have some professionals, and this isn't necessarily even specific to generation, but certainly gets lumped into generations. You're going to have some professionals, like, let's use technology. If you say everyone has to do it this exact way, and this is the only way that we can do it, for some of your professionals, that's going to be super easy. They're going to jump on board. They're going to be like, yeah, no problem. I do new technology every single day. I do that. You're going to have other professionals on your team that it's going to take them now twice as long to do their work, because that's just not a space that they're comfortable in. And so maybe the way that they were doing it otherwise isn't perfectly optimized, or it's not perfectly, in line with whatever the best practices for technology, but they were doing good work and they were doing a good job. And so I think having those open lines of communication to say, hey, okay, we're changing this or we're doing this. Where do you see that in your space? How can we fit this into the work that you're doing? Okay, we are making this kind of the best policy and the best practice for our staff. I've noticed that this is something that you're maybe struggling with, or that is frustrating you, or that you're challenged by. Like, let's talk through that. And really, I think recognizing that everyone's going to approach this work a little bit differently. I think that that's okay. And I know there are going to be people who are listening that are like, no, every admission counselor needs to do the job exactly the same way, because that's the only way that we can measure it. And that's the only way that we can say that every student had the same experience. I get it. I get the data side of it, to say we want it to be super clean and we want it to all look the same. However, this is a field about people. People are doing the work. People are the ones that are coming to the process. People are the ones that are going through the process. Students are going to engage with us differently. Parents are going to engage with us differently. You talk about generations, even though your interactions are with different generations of people. The parents you work with are of different generations. We have parents that had children very, very young, and so now they're very young parents going through the college search process. We have parents that had children later in life, and so now they're older parents approaching retirement or in retirement going through the college search process. I think when you talk about generational communication, it goes back to what we've talked about a couple different times, Jeremy, is just being open to recognizing that it's different, and navigating through kind of what that's looked like. We've brought in speakers in our office. Actually, just during our winter training this year, we brought in a professional from external to our team to talk about generational differences and how we approach situations and what things are priorities for different generations. And I mean, you think about what each generation has lived through, those big earth shattering generational differences. Yeah, older generations maybe lived through that too, but they weren't maybe in their prime high school years when some event happened, or they weren't in their formative college and professional years when a different event happened. And so even just recognizing the communal life that we've lived as generations is going to look different, and that's going to impact the reactions that we have to things. It was really interesting. And I think having those conversations and being open to it is really important.
For anybody, well, quite honestly, for anybody listening to this, but definitely for anybody who's in a direct leadership position at the director, AVP, or VP position, I encourage you literally play back the last 4 to 5 minutes of what Angie just said, because as somebody who, when I travel around and work on all these campuses and do literally 15 to 20 individual meetings with everybody at every level, this is why, whether people want to believe it or not, I truly believe, Angie, more people have left the profession in the last 24 to 36 months is they're not getting what they need out of their leadership. They're not getting leadership to go, but that's not the way that works best for me. And I don't feel comfortable saying that to you. And you don't say that to me if you even have individual meetings with me. And so just recognizing it 100% is step one. One of the things I've always admired about you most, Angie, and this is one of the reasons that it's always fun to interact with you, is you are super passionate about professional development, not only for yourself, but for those around you. And in 2019, I know you and a good friend started Elevate, which is a series of development seminars for women leaders with, correct me if I'm wrong, at least 8 years in higher ed enrollment management. Help us understand, where did the motivation come from for you and your colleague to say, this is something we want to do? Walk us through that.
Sure. So I think for me, it was getting to a place where I had been in this field for a little bit of time, right? We talk a lot about like, hey, you're in for three or you're in for life. And so we invest a ton of resources as a field into our new professionals. And we do a lot of professional development. We have statewide programs and we have all of these things for those 1 to 3 year professionals. And I was looking around, and in Illinois, we've been really blessed. We also have a middle management institute. And so those are sort of that next step, like 3 to 8 years. And that's where the 8 year number came from. It's nothing magical. It was just, I was kind of looking at what we already had in Illinois. And I said, well, we have this program for new professionals, New Counselor Institute, and we have this program for rising leaders and middle managers in our Middle Management Institute. And then we kind of just didn't have anything. And I was sort of in that space at that time. And I was looking around and I was like, I just didn't see a lot of leaders that were not white men in the space. And I don't say that to bash white men. Like, I just want to be really clear about that. We have really amazing thought leaders in our field. I was just looking around and I was like, I just feel like there's space for more voices and for more views and for more opportunities. And so with Courtney Wallace, who's at Augustana, and she is a remarkable human and professional and brilliant at what she does. She and I kind of started talking about it, and we were both like, well, let's do something. Let's ask and let's see if there's space for this. And I think that's the best piece of advice that I can give people. Like, if you see a void, if you're like, hey, this seems to be missing. And even if you only raise the question because you feel like it's missing for you, I say ask the question because it might be missing for other people too. And so, I mean, that's really where it came out of, is just saying like, gosh, I wish that there was more things and questions that I could ask with other people that were sort of in the same space and identified the same way that I do. I will share that in Illinois, we're actually reevaluating that whole program right now. We've done it for 2 years. It was an awesome opportunity. We had two cohorts go through. And one of the things that we've identified is, yes, this is certainly really important for women to have a space, but what about any of our other marginalized populations who we also don't see in leadership roles? And so we're taking a pause on Elevate for this year, and we're actually going to reassess how can we reuse Elevate's model to make sure that we can create space for any population in our field. And so it might look different in the future. And I think that that's awesome that, something can be created and it can exist and it can be great. And it can change into something else to better serve our profession as a whole. And that's something that I think is really, really neat.
We're going to end with something I call fun rapid fire. So I'm just going to give you a handful of things.
These always give me anxiety.
No anxiety needed. First thing that pops in your head, all right? More enjoyable activity for you, wakeboarding or snowboarding?
Oh, wakeboarding. I don't do snow.
McDonald's fountain Coke or coffee?
Fountain Coke all the way. I have one right here.
Favorite cheese to put on a charcuterie board? Rumor is you like those.
Oh, I do love a charcuterie board. I love a honey goat cheese.
Underrated vacation spot you would recommend for listeners?
I don't know that it's underrated, but our favorite place that we went in the last few years is Costa Rica. We loved Costa Rica.
And the best piece of advice, because I know just in my conversations, I've talked to a lot of them and I cover, not even a tenth of the country throughout my travels in a year. Best piece of advice you have just for any new moms listening who work in higher ed, because I know you've lived that.
Yeah, you can do it. If you've ever heard me speak, you know that I don't believe in work-life balance. I believe in work-life flow. And so whether you are a mom or a parent or a puppy parent or whatever that is, there's going to be days in your life where it's going to be more work, and there's going to be days in your life when it's going to be more home, and give yourself the grace to let that flow. I think the concept of work-life balance sets us up for failure. So give yourself grace and know that you are capable of doing all of it.
Thank you so much for making time today and just sharing all those thoughts with us. I think this is going to help a ton of people. If people do want to connect with you offline, Angie, what's the best way to go about that? Email, LinkedIn, your LinkedIn stuff will be 100% in the post-editing notes, but what's the best way to ultimately connect with you offline?
Yeah, I love LinkedIn. I've kind of leaned into it in the last couple of years. I think it's very fun. You get my random brain thoughts there sometimes. But yeah, message me there and I'm happy to have a conversation. Or, if you just want to go get coffee. I don't drink coffee, but I'll meet you for coffee anytime. But I love having those conversations and just talking about the work in the field that we're in. Reach out anytime. Happy to.
I strongly encourage anybody listening to do that. I know I get asked all the time. So, Jeremy, what does it cost to reach out to you? And I'm like, nothing, your time. And so if any of you listening, and I'm not just saying that for me, I'm saying that if you've enjoyed listening to Angie, please reach out to her. I strongly encourage you to do that, because even if it's just to have a quick conversation or get a quick piece of feedback, I know her well enough. I feel like I can say she would be happy to chat. So Angie, I appreciate you, my friend, and good luck and enjoy the rest of your summer.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bye, everybody.
Hey, all, Zach here from Enrollify. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mission Admissions with Jeremy Tiers. If you like this episode, do us a huge favor and hit that follow and subscribe button below. Furthermore, if you've got just 2 minutes to spare, we would greatly appreciate you leaving a rating and a review of this show on Apple Podcasts. Our podcast network is growing by the month, and we've got a plethora of marketing, admissions, and higher ed technology shows that are jam-packed with stories, ideas, and frameworks that are all designed to empower you to become a better higher ed professional. But Enrollify is far more than just a podcast network. Enrollify is where higher ed comes to learn new marketing skills, discover new products and services, and find their next job. We're a growing learning community of 4,000 members, and we'd love to welcome you into the fold. You can access our free blog articles, newsletters, e-courses, and more, or purchase our master course on how to market a university with Terry Flannery at enrollify.org. We look forward to meeting you soon and welcoming you into the community. Again, you can subscribe for free at enrollify.org.